So our next presenter was born with controller in hand, and he spends his days at Volition Inc. in Downtown Champaign, working on one of the most outlandish games in the history of mankind. The remainder of his time is spent contemplating the nature of the medium, which mostly just involves playing video games. He is Tyler Penrod.
Video games can never be art. These are the words by this man, Roger Ebert, in a blog post that ignited the internet in a flurry of hate mail and furious response, as the internet is wont to do. Now, I've never had a beef with the guy, but he's driven me to come up here and explain why he's flat out wrong, because, as he did admit later, never can kind of be a long time. Now, I work for game development studio Volition Inc. in Downtown Champaign developing this game, Saints Row the Third. It uses over-the-top action and crude humor to be one of the most shamelessly plugged, must-buy titles this holiday season, releasing everywhere on November 15th for the Xbox, PS3, and PC. So Ebert, fair enough, but I've also seen countless summer blockbusters that would be a stretch to call art. Michael Bay films come to mind for some reason. So, for the sake of argument, let's really examine the history of art and parallel it to games and come to our own conclusions about the medium. Now, I'm not going to be able to convince everyone in such a short time, but we can at least see how games have developed and where they're going, and a few standout titles worthy of the integral to games' evolution. Pong, for example, is akin to early caveman paintings, releasing at a time when games rely heavily on symbolism and abstraction. Two moving sticks and a small white dot could take on entirely new meanings to the player. And although they had simplistic narrative, such as the princess is in another castle, Mario and early games possess a level of surrealism that can be really bizarre when placed into realistic contexts. No one ever seems to question why an Italian plumber is jumping on turtle shells and eating magic mushrooms, or what kind of eating disorders Pac-Man possessed. Not long after Mario, games would begin to develop narrative and plot beyond these simple premises. Stories evolve past excuses to shoot everything in sight and instead carry the player through an emotional journey. With increases in technology, the artistic direction of games can also begin to take on intentional influence from existing artistic periods. Games like the Final Fantasy series evoke the Romanticism period, with plot that centers on rebellion against industrialization, much like the art period itself. The games contain themes of escapism, exploration, adventure, and perfectly encapsulate what games are as a whole. It's also one of the first and most memorable games to actually kill off a main love interest for good, taking on Shakespearean levels of tragedy. To this day, many players swear that you can still resurrect the character of Eris, exemplifying the deep bond that's formed between them and the narrative. Shadow of the Colossus uses similar narrative concepts as you aim to defeat immense guardians throughout the world, exchanging a deal with a demon in exchange for the life of a girl you love. The game takes on incredibly Faustian themes and narrative, and one of the most often cited games when their artistic nature is questioned. The story is simplistic, but it's how players progress through that story where the game finds its true beauty. The game asks players to really contemplate their actions as they engage the narrative in a way that simply wouldn't work within a film or a novel. But despite these narrative strides, games are constantly moving towards realism. Technology becomes bigger and greater, and we have hit a plateau of realism as games move towards the uncanny valley, the point at which characters become creepy instead of acceptably real. A recently released game, for example, Heavy Rain, is an interesting mix of realism and narrative that jumps straight into that valley. Borrowing heavily from Hollywood suspense thrillers, the control is almost entirely taken away from you in this case, pushing buttons during timed sequences to provide one of several outcomes. Your actions and choices determine how the plot resolves, with multiple endings and outcomes possible. Designed with the highest point of technology in mind, this is as close to a film as many games get. So once you hit that level of realism and influence from other mediums, where do you go? What's the solution? Well, much like art history itself, it's at this point games begin to move away from that realism into something more simplistic and personal, but where they begin to study the medium as a whole and where the power of games truly lies. The unique power of games comes from choice. More and more games are providing multiple ways to approach the narrative. In Mass Effect, for example, you can choose your love interest, save one life over another, or just be a complete dick. The point is that it becomes your decision, a way for you to shape your experience and what you take away from the game. Another game embodying Pachaka-Cha, if there ever was one, Jason Rohrer's Passage, is a game that lasts only 5 minutes, yet it gives you potentially limitless options and direction as you make the most of the time you have. Players can find love, treasure, and take other paths, each option limiting others. Ultimately, it's a game that asks us to examine our own lives and how the choices within the game might reflect our own personal ones. Games like The Sims examine life from a similar perspective. You're given the tools in the world to do with what you wish. The game portion are simply goals you set for yourself within the paradigm, similar to life itself. Players insert reflections of their own lives and what they wish their lives could be, or simply drown themselves in a swimming pool. But moving forward, many games continue to become incredibly postmodern, using that concept of choice and what games are to defy expectation. Portal is an example that takes the reliant narrator tutorial concept and flips it on its head by making it the antagonist. The player solves a series of puzzles and levels in order to gain a promised reward of cake, a prize that you never actually obtain. The player escapes this paradigm and sees the game for what it really is, a set of twisted experiments with no purpose and no freedom. There are no points and there is no reward. It allows the player to see it as a game. Sure, it's wrapped with an entertaining dialogue and complex puzzle design, but it plays with our expectations of what a game should be. And as games move forward, games should be games. They have to stop borrowing from other forms of art. Other media can inspire them, but it can't overwhelm the nature of the medium. Ultimately, these are games, and that's the point. If it was a movie or a novel, the experience would never work. You can't essentially have your cake and eat it too. And as games continue to develop, more and more there will be attempts to redefine what it means to be a game. Art is a concept that continually redefines itself, even when we already have a pretty good idea of what it consists of. Couldn't the same be said for games? And for every Angry Birds, Call of Duty, and yes, Saints Row, there will be games attempting to redefine what they can convey emotionally and personally. After all, games have only been around for about 40 years or so. I'm excited to see where they go and what they have to say in the years to come. So, are games art? Maybe. But, Mr. Ebert, never is a really long time. Thank you.